For 7 long years, Ghost had walked the same streets, unseen, unnoticed, a shadow in the background of the town's busy life. No one had ever bothered to approach him, no one had ever called out to him, and no one had ever truly seen the pain and neglect that was etched in his eyes. To the world, he was just another stray dog, but to those who paid close attention, he was so much more, a broken soul, wandering the same path year after year without a single human being to offer him the compassion he desperately needed. The town itself was quiet and quaint, nestled between fields and forests, a place where the hustle and bustle of city life seemed a world away. It was a place where people were friendly but busy, too busy to notice the dog that had become nothing more than a ghost to them. Ghost had no home, no family, and no one to care for him. He didn't bark at people, he didn't beg for food, and he didn't cause trouble. He simply existed, quietly, in the shadows of the town's existence, like a forgotten figure in a painting, always present but never acknowledged. His fur had grown coarse over the years, matted with dirt and grime, his ribs clearly visible beneath the layers of neglect. One of his ears was torn, the result of a life lived on the streets, and a limp in his hind leg spoke of an old injury, one that had never been treated, left to fester in silence. But still, he survived. Year after year, through the harsh winters, the scorching summers, and the storms that battered the town, Ghost endured. He slept under porches, rummaged through trash cans, and disappeared into the woods when people got too close. He was not an aggressive dog, nor did he beg for food like some strays. He was different, detached, distant, resigned to his fate. He simply existed in the periphery of the town's daily life, never a part of it, but always present. It was almost as if he had become a fixture of the town, just as familiar as the old oak tree in the center of the square or the worn-out benches by the park. People came and went, but Ghost remained. As the years passed, the town's curiosity about him slowly faded. Children used to whisper stories about him at school. Some believed that he had once belonged to someone who had moved away, abandoning him without a second thought. Others thought that he had escaped something terrible, a traumatic event that had left him scarred, both physically and emotionally. But with time, even the children grew less interested. Ghost became just another forgotten part of the town, no different than the crumbling buildings and the rusted fences that lined the streets. His story, whatever it had been, was no longer important to anyone. The town had moved on, and so had its people. Ghost's existence was now defined by indifference. He was a shadow that moved quietly through the streets, unnoticed by most, and ignored by the rest. The only ones who paid attention to him were those who were momentarily curious or those who had a soft spot for strays. Some people tossed scraps of food his way, but that was the extent of the kindness he received. No one stopped to ask where he came from or why he was always alone. No one cared. The world around him continued to move on, leaving him behind, and yet Ghost persisted. He carried on day after day, year after year, as if his existence had become a mere routine, something he was bound to, despite the loneliness and the neglect that defined his life. He never once attempted to approach anyone, nor did he make any effort to engage with the people who passed him by. It was as though he had given up on the idea of connection, resigned to a life of solitude and survival. But even in his quiet existence, Ghost held a quiet dignity, a silent strength that few could comprehend. He had learned how to survive on his own, navigating the streets with the ease of a dog who had long ago abandoned any hope of finding a home. His body, though worn and battered, still carried an air of resilience. He had weathered the worst of life on the streets, and yet he endured. His quiet existence was a stark contrast to the lives of the people who lived in the town. They rushed about their days, caught up in their routines, their families, and their worries. They saw the dog, but they didn't see him. They knew he was there, but they didn't care to know his story. He was just another stray, another invisible being lost in the background of their busy lives. But Ghost wasn't just a stray dog. He was a living reminder of all the things that were forgotten, ignored, and left behind. He was a symbol of the broken, the lost, and the unseen. And for 7 long years he had wandered the streets, carrying the weight of all that had been left behind. His body marked by wounds, his heart scarred by abandonment, but his spirit, though fragile, still intact. And yet, in the stillness of his existence, something was about to change. Something was about to happen that would shatter the quiet routine of Ghost's life and bring him face to face with the possibility of hope, something he had long ago given up on. This was just the beginning. David had seen many things in his life, far more than he had ever wished to. He had felt the weight of loss in ways that no one should ever have to. Years of service in the army had left scars on his mind and body, scars that no one could see, but that would never heal. When he left the army, he thought he was leaving behind the horrors of war, but he quickly realized that peace wasn't as easy to find as he had hoped. The noise of the world, the constant buzz of memories, the ghosts of lost friends, and the ever-present tension wasn't something that could simply be turned off. That's why it came here, to this small, quiet town nestled between fields and forests, far from the noise of his past. He had bought a small house on the outskirts, hoping that solitude and the simplicity of rural life might offer him the peace he so desperately needed. He needed to disappear, to find a space where the world couldn't find him, somewhere the quiet could help him heal, somewhere the pain of the past could finally fade. It wasn't much, just a small house with a worn-out porch and a view of the woods. But it was his. It was isolated enough to give him the freedom to be alone with his thoughts, with his memories. And for a while, it worked. The silence of the town, the stillness of the fields, and the endless stretches of trees gave him room to breathe. At first, the loneliness was heavy, but it wasn't the kind of loneliness that burned. It was the kind that pressed softly against you, giving you space, but never letting you forget its presence. David had kept to his routines. Every morning, he would take a walk along a frost-covered trail that wound its way through the woods near his home. It was a ritual of sorts, a way to start his day with some semblance of normalcy. He didn't mind the solitude of these walks. It was calming, almost meditative, and the crisp morning air helped clear his mind, even if just for a little while. But that particular morning was different. The quiet, familiar path that he had walked for weeks had a strange feel to it. Maybe it was the way the frost glistened on the trees, or the way the silence seemed to stretch a little further than usual. Or maybe it was the unexpected movement he saw out of the corner of his eye as he passed a collapsed wooden shed. At first, David thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light, a fleeting glimpse of something that wasn't really there. But then his eyes locked onto a pair of wide, alert eyes staring back at him. They were yellow, dull, and weary, but unmistakably present. The figure that they belonged to was thin, trembling slightly from the cold, yet there was a certain dignity about it, a sense of pride despite its obvious wear and tear. The dog was watching him, studying him, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. The dog didn't bark or move, but it was aware of David's presence in a way that most stray animals weren't. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't afraid, but it was cautious, and it was alone, just like David. David stopped in his tracks. Something shifted inside him at that moment. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pity, it was recognition. He could see himself in those eyes, the same guarded wariness, the same reluctance to trust, the same quiet loneliness that mirrored the silence he had come to know in his own life. This dog was broken, just like him, in ways that weren't visible to the world. For a long moment, neither David nor the dog moved. They simply stood there, two beings locked in a silent exchange. David's heartbeat quickened, a surge of emotion stirring inside him. He couldn't explain it, but the connection was undeniable. The dog was like him, a soul carrying invisible scars, both of them discarded by the world around them. David didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. Instead, he simply stood there, holding the dog's gaze. The silence between them was thick, heavy with understanding, and yet neither of them moved. Slowly, David crouched down, reducing his height to appear less threatening. He extended his hand palm up in a gesture of peace, though he wasn't sure why he was doing it. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly, his voice calm, but even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure the dog understood them. The dog didn't flinch at first, but then it did. Its body stiffened slightly, as if unsure whether this human was safe. The dog's ears twitched, its eyes never leaving David's face. Then, in a swift movement, the dog retreated, darting back into the shadows beneath the wreckage of the shed. David felt a pang of disappointment, but it was brief. What surprised him more was the overwhelming sense of determination that surged through him. He understood this dog. He understood the fear, the hesitation, the need to protect oneself from the world. He had been there. He had learned to hide from the world in the same way, to carry invisible wounds that no one could see. "I'll be back," he murmured softly, more to himself than to the dog. It wasn't a promise he had made to anyone but the dog, but it was a promise nonetheless. He knew that something needed to change. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he knew he wouldn't give up on this dog. He couldn't. The following days passed slowly. David continued his routine of walking through the woods, but now, every morning, he took a small offering of food, bits of cooked chicken or leftover bread, and left them by the shed. He wasn't sure if the dog would come or if it even remembered him, but he hoped that somehow, through the simple act of kindness, he might be able to build some form of trust with this creature. At first, there was no sign of the dog. The food would disappear by the next morning, but David never saw the dog. He wasn't discouraged. He knew it would take time. Trust wasn't something that could be earned in a single day. Then, one afternoon, while David was returning from a grocery run, he spotted a thin, familiar silhouette slipping out from under a porch. It was the dog, Ghost, as he had come to think of him. Ghost gave a quick glance at David before limping away. It wasn't much, but it was enough. David felt his heart stir. The dog had noticed him again. He was beginning to come closer. Without thinking, David placed a small bowl of leftover chicken on the ground. He backed up several paces, giving Ghost space, not wanting to push him too far too fast. Hesitant but hungry, Ghost approached the food, sniffing the air cautiously. He took a few careful bites, his body still tense, his eyes darting around, ready to flee at the slightest provocation. But for that brief moment, they shared something, an unspoken understanding, a quiet moment of connection. And then, just as quickly, Ghost vanished back into the trees, leaving David alone once again. That night, as David lay in bed, he couldn't help but replay the encounter in his mind. It stirred something deep within him, a memory of his time in the service, of the soldiers and civilians he had treated, of the bonds formed in the face of fear and pain. He had seen the same guarded look in their eyes, the same flicker of hope that came from the smallest act of kindness. David knew that he couldn't save the world, but maybe, just maybe, he could save this dog. Maybe he could show Ghost that not all humans were like the ones who had abandoned him. He had a mission again, a purpose that had been absent from his life since he hung up his uniform. And so, David's quiet mission began. Day by day, he continued to leave food for Ghost, each small sign of acceptance, a longer pause before Ghost fled, a momentary glance, felt like a triumph. The bond, fragile as it was, had begun. As the days passed, David's routine remained unchanged. Every morning before the sun rose, he would leave his house and walk the quiet path that wound through the woods to the dilapidated shed. His steps, though quiet, were determined, his purpose clear. He knew the town was waking up, people were getting on with their day, but he had one mission now, one thing that mattered more than anything else. It was Ghost. Each morning he carried small offerings, bits of cooked chicken, slices of soft bread, and fresh water in an old bowl that had seen better days. He placed them carefully by the broken wood of the shed, always stepping back and giving Ghost space. At first, there was nothing. The food would disappear, but the dog never showed himself. David wasn't discouraged. He knew it would take time. Trust wasn't something that could be earned overnight. But with each passing day, the quiet signs of progress filled him with quiet hope. Ghost's acceptance wasn't immediate, but David's resolve only grew stronger. There was something about the dog that stirred David. It wasn't just the fact that Ghost was a stray, abandoned, and forgotten by the world. It wasn't even the way Ghost's eyes had seemed to look at him with silent recognition, as if he knew something that no one else could understand. It was more than that. David saw in Ghost's quiet existence a reflection of his own life, his own scars, both visible and invisible. David had fought wars in foreign lands, had seen death, destruction, and despair in ways that most could never imagine. He had been a medic on the front lines, a healer of sorts in places where healing was the last thing anyone expected. But despite his best efforts, despite saving countless lives, he couldn't save everyone. And when the war ended, when he came home, he realized that the battle didn't stop. It continued quietly inside of him. The ghosts of the past never truly left. They hovered, waiting for moments when the silence grew too loud, when the weight of the memories became unbearable. But the dog, Ghost, he understood that. He had his own ghosts, ones that could never be erased. And so David kept going. He kept showing up every morning, offering food, offering space, offering a kind gesture that was never returned with anything but silence. He wasn't expecting anything in return. It was the way it had always been for him. The war had taught him that sometimes the best you could do was try, even when there was no guarantee of success. David was beginning to understand the dog better than he'd expected. He recognized that the road to healing was never a straight line. It was messy, it was slow, and it was filled with setbacks, but it was worth it, even if no one else saw it. He knew that no one in the town would understand the quiet commitment that had taken hold of him. They had long moved on from the stray dog they called Ghost. It was just another piece of the background to them, but to David it was everything. One morning, after leaving the usual food offerings, David sat on the log just outside the shed, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. He hadn't expected much, as he had already seen the same pattern over the last few weeks: leave food, wait, and leave again. But today felt different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a quiet tension, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He sat still, not looking directly at the dog's hiding place, giving Ghost the space to decide whether he was safe enough to approach. The moments stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. The cool autumn air brushed against his skin, and David breathed deeply, focusing on the quiet around him. He didn't want to rush this moment, didn't want to force it. And then it happened. Slowly, cautiously, Ghost emerged from his hiding spot, limping softly but steadily across the grass. His body was tense, his tail held low, but he was moving forward. David remained still, watching with quiet hope in his chest. Ghost's eyes flickered briefly to David's face, and for a second David thought he saw something there. Something almost like recognition, or perhaps understanding. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The dog sniffed the air, his nose twitching as he approached the food David had left for him. He circled the bowl once, hesitated for a moment, and then, with cautious determination, he took the first bite. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was a step forward. David didn't move. He didn't dare breathe too loudly. He knew that this moment was fragile, and he didn't want to scare the dog away. The minutes stretched on, and David watched as Ghost ate, his movements slow and deliberate, as though each bite was a test. After a few moments, the dog lifted his head, meeting David's eyes once more. For just a second, they locked gazes. Two beings, both scarred by the world around them, both hesitant to trust, but both finding something in each other. And then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Ghost finished his meal, gave a final glance at David, and limped away into the trees, disappearing once again into the shadows. But David didn't feel disappointment. He felt a quiet sense of triumph. The trust was beginning to grow, slowly, but it was there. In the following days, David continued his routine. Every morning he placed food and water in the same spot, just as he had before. But this time there was a subtle difference. Ghost wasn't just avoiding him anymore. The dog had begun to show signs of acceptance, small, quiet gestures that made David's heart swell with hope. Each time the dog came a little closer, each time Ghost lingered just a bit longer, David knew that he was making progress. But it wasn't just about the dog anymore. The town was beginning to notice David's efforts. The residents had long since grown indifferent to the stray dog, dismissing him as just another fixture of the town. But now they saw David walking past their houses every morning, carrying food for a dog they had long forgotten. Some of them raised their eyebrows or shook their heads, muttering things like, "That dog's been around for years. Why bother now?" Others were more curious, though no one was quite ready to offer help. One morning, as David was walking toward the shed, he passed an older man who had been standing on his porch, watching him. The man crossed his arms, a skeptical look on his face. "You're wasting your time," he called out. "That dog's been here forever. Ain't nobody ever been able to get close to him. Don't even bother."
David paused, but he didn't let the comment bother him. He simply nodded politely, as he always did, and continued on his way. It was clear that most people had given up on Ghost. To them, he was a lost cause, a part of the town's background that no one had time to care about. But David wasn't like most people. He had seen enough in his life to know that sometimes the greatest changes came from the most unexpected places. And this dog, this broken, neglected creature, was worth his time. David wasn't just feeding Ghost anymore. He was showing him that there was still kindness in the world, that not all humans were the same, and that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. The dog didn't owe David anything, but David, in some way, needed this dog. The more time he spent with Ghost, the more he realized that this wasn't just about saving the dog. It was about saving himself, too. As the days wore on, David's commitment to Ghost deepened. His mornings were no longer just routines. They were moments of connection, however fleeting, moments when he wasn't alone in the world. The trust was growing, the bond was building, and David knew that the dog would be ready to trust him in time. He just had to be patient. And so, David continued his quiet mission. He had no idea where it would lead, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to give up on this dog. Not now, not ever. As the days turned into weeks, David's life became increasingly intertwined with the silent, stoic existence of the stray dog he had come to know as Ghost. Each morning, without fail, David would wake before dawn, prepare his offerings, and walk the familiar path to the shed where Ghost had first appeared to him. The routine was more than just an act of kindness. It was a promise, a quiet vow to a creature that had been abandoned, just as David had felt abandoned by the world after his years of service. David's dedication never wavered. His mornings remained filled with the same quiet rituals, placing the food and water down, stepping back, and waiting for that single moment when the dog might come closer, when their worlds might briefly touch. And slowly, cautiously, Ghost began to show small signs of change. At first, it was just the faintest hint of movement. Ghost's head would appear from the shadow of the shed, his eyes peering out, assessing the situation. David remained as still as possible, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, the dog would approach the food. Not quickly, but deliberately, his steps slow and careful, as though each one required deep consideration. David would hold his breath, watching as Ghost took the first bite, always from a distance. Each time, it was the same. David did not rush the dog. He did not force the moment. He simply waited. With every passing day, Ghost became a little braver. The pauses grew shorter. The moments of hesitation, before Ghost would turn and retreat back into the shadows, became less frequent. And in their place was something new, a flicker of trust. A flicker that, like the morning sun, would slowly and gently shine through the cracks of Ghost's cautious heart. It was a slow burn, the process of trust. A dance of sorts, one where each small movement, each gesture, carried weight. It was fragile, as all real connections were. But David had been patient, and the dog was beginning to respond. There was a softness in Ghost's movements now, a gradual surrender to the quiet presence of the man who had shown him kindness. One cold morning, after weeks of leaving food for Ghost, David spotted something that filled him with cautious hope. As he walked toward the shed, he saw the dog, a little closer than before, standing just beyond the edge of the trees. His coat was still ragged, but it looked a little shinier now, the dullness of neglect fading with each passing week. His eyes, too, were a little less wary. There was still a distance, an invisible barrier between them, but David could sense the shift. Ghost looked at him, then at the food, and then, for the first time, he didn't run. He didn't retreat. The dog took a hesitant step forward, his eyes never leaving David, and when he stopped just short of the food, David crouched down, offering his hand in the same slow, deliberate way he always did. "I'm not here to hurt you," David murmured softly, his voice calm, his posture non-threatening. Ghost flinched, just slightly, but he didn't run. For a long moment, they simply stood there, David with his hand extended, Ghost frozen in place, watching him intently. David didn't move. He didn't say anything more. He simply waited. His patience was the only thing he could offer to the dog. And then, incredibly, Ghost moved forward. Not quickly, but steadily. His nose twitched, and he sniffed the air, clearly curious but still cautious. The dog reached the food, and without further hesitation, he ate. This time, however, there was no hesitation, no retreating back into the shadows. Ghost lingered a little longer, his movements less stiff, his body language less guarded. It was a quiet breakthrough, something that only David could truly appreciate. The following days saw Ghost gradually moving closer to David. At first, it was just a few steps, then a few more. Sometimes, he would come all the way to the food and eat it in full view of David, standing a few feet away, offering the slightest acknowledgement. Other times, he would still dart back into the safety of the trees or the underbrush after eating. But with each interaction, Ghost's movements grew less hurried, less anxious. The dog was learning to trust, just as David was learning to be patient. David's efforts didn't go unnoticed by the community, though not everyone reacted positively. Some of the townsfolk still believed that Ghost was beyond saving, that he was just a part of the background, a fixture in the town's daily life. They were indifferent to the transformation that was quietly unfolding before them. A few of them raised eyebrows when they saw David walking through the streets with food for the dog. "That dog's been around for years," one neighbor, an older man named Mr. Thompson, said one afternoon as he watched David pass by. "He's probably better off left alone. You're just wasting your time." David didn't say anything. He simply nodded, knowing that some people wouldn't understand. But that didn't matter. The dog mattered. That's all that mattered. Other neighbors, however, were beginning to take notice. Curiosity had begun to stir. They had seen David's quiet dedication, his unyielding patience, and they couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to this stray dog than met the eye. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson, a kind-hearted woman who lived a few houses down, approached David as he was leaving food by the shed. "Is that the same dog that's been hanging around for years?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. David nodded, though he didn't offer more than that. "He's a good boy, really," Mrs. Patterson added, glancing over at Ghost, who was lingering at the edge of the woods. "I always thought there was something different about him, but I never got close enough to find out. I've seen you with him lately. Seems like he's warming up to you." David smiled faintly. "He's just taking his time," he said softly, watching as Ghost's cautious eyes shifted toward him. "It's been a long road, but he's starting to trust." Mrs. Patterson watched the dog for a few moments before nodding. "I hope he makes it. It's a shame how the town just let him be." David's heart warmed slightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small sign of support, a glimmer of recognition in a town that had long since forgotten Ghost. As the days turned into weeks, more people began to notice David's quiet mission. Some of them offered small acts of kindness, like leaving out scraps of food for Ghost, or offering a gentle word of encouragement to David as he walked through town. Others, like Mr. Thompson, remained steadfast in their belief that Ghost was beyond saving. But for David, the quiet signs of progress were enough. With each small step, the bond between David and Ghost grew. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Ghost was becoming more than just a stray dog to David. He was becoming a companion, a reminder of the strength that lay in patience, in trust, and in the quiet moments of connection that could heal even the deepest wounds. David didn't know where this journey would take him. He didn't know if Ghost would ever fully trust him, or if he would ever find a home. But he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't giving up. Not on the dog, not on himself, not on the second chance they both needed. And so, the days continued, one after another, as David and Ghost moved closer to something neither of them could have imagined. A quiet healing, one step at a time. As the days bled into weeks, David's daily routine became second nature to him. His morning started the same way: early, quiet, and steady. The walk through the woods, the chilled morning air filling his lungs, the familiar crunch of his boots against the frost-covered trail. The path to the shed had become more than just a route to place food for the stray dog. It had become a part of David's life. A ritual, a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. Ghost's progress, though gradual, was undeniable. Each morning, David would place food and water near the shed, always stepping back to give the dog space, and always with the hope that Ghost would take another step closer. The dog, still wary and unsure, had begun to show signs of recognition. Sometimes, he would linger a little longer before retreating into the shadows. Other times, he would cautiously eat his meal while David stood a few feet away, silent, patient, observing. The bond between them had deepened. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was silent, like the unspoken connection between two souls who had both experienced pain and loss in different ways. Ghost, though still distant, was beginning to trust again, and David found himself feeling something he hadn't in a long time: hope. But even as the trust between them grew, the world around them remained largely indifferent. The townspeople continued their lives, busy with their own concerns. A few people would glance at David as he walked through the town, food in hand for the stray dog. Some of them offered a silent nod or a polite wave, while others, like Mr. Thompson, remained firm in their disbelief. "Waste of time," they would say. "That dog's been around for years. What's the point?" David didn't let the cynicism of others affect him. He knew the importance of patience, especially when it came to Ghost. The dog wasn't just another stray. He was a living reminder of everything that had been forgotten, everything that had been discarded. Just like David, Ghost had spent years alone, wandering the streets, unnoticed and ignored. And yet, here they were, two beings who had once been invisible, now finding a quiet connection that neither of them had ever expected. One afternoon, as David was walking back from the woods, he noticed a few people gathered near the corner of the street. They were talking in hushed tones, their eyes flicking toward him. David didn't pay them much attention at first, but when he reached the porch of his house, Mrs. Patterson approached him, her expression soft and concerned. "You know," she said, glancing toward the shed, "we've all been watching you. The way you've been taking care of that dog. It's something we should have done long ago." She paused, her eyes thoughtful. "People are starting to notice." David shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. He wasn't doing it for recognition, and he certainly didn't want any praise. But Mrs. Patterson's words stirred something inside him. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It wasn't just about showing kindness. Something was changing, slowly but surely. The town was beginning to see Ghost, to see what David had been seeing all along. They were beginning to acknowledge his presence. "I'm just doing what's right," David said quietly, though he wasn't sure he believed it. It didn't feel like just the right thing to do. It felt like something more, something that went beyond just feeding a stray dog. "That's what I mean," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice soft but firm. "People are starting to care. And that's because of you." She smiled gently. "It's about time." David nodded, still feeling uneasy with the attention. But he couldn't deny the change that was taking place. The townspeople were beginning to take note. The conversations, once held in whispers, were starting to shift. They weren't just talking about the stray dog anymore. They were talking about what David was doing for him. They were talking about compassion. The next few days brought more subtle changes. David noticed the neighbors tossing scraps of food near the shed as they passed by, offering small gestures of kindness to Ghost. Mrs. Patterson had started leaving bits of chicken by the fence near her house, and old Mr. Grant, who usually didn't care about anything beyond his garden, had placed a bowl of water near the front porch one particularly hot afternoon. It was small, insignificant acts, but they were acts of care, acts of recognition. David continued with his routine, still leaving food for Ghost every morning, still stepping back to give the dog space, still waiting for that quiet moment of trust. And over time, Ghost began to show more signs of change. His fur, once coarse and matted, began to grow in a little more neatly. His limp, though still visible, seemed less pronounced. There was a slight shift in his body language, a quiet acceptance of the world around him. And though he didn't come as close to David as he had hoped, there was a definite difference. One day, while David was placing food near the shed, he noticed a small movement at the corner of his eye. When he turned, he saw Ghost, standing just a few feet away, watching him. David's heart skipped a beat. The dog wasn't running, wasn't retreating. He was simply standing there, looking at David, as if waiting for something. David held his breath. Slowly, carefully, he crouched down, offering his hand, just as he had done so many times before. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered, his voice barely a murmur in the stillness of the morning. The next few days brought more subtle changes. David noticed the neighbors tossing scraps of food near the shed as they passed by, offering small gestures of kindness to Ghost. Mrs. Patterson had started leaving bits of chicken by the fence near her house, and old Mr. Grant, who usually didn't care about anything beyond his garden, had placed a bowl of water near the front porch one particularly hot afternoon. It was small, insignificant acts, but they were acts of care, acts of recognition. David continued with his routine, still leaving food for Ghost every morning, still stepping back to give the dog space, still waiting for that quiet moment of trust. And over time, Ghost began to show more signs of change. His fur, once coarse and matted, began to grow in a little more neatly. His limp, though still visible, seemed less pronounced. There was a slight shift in his body language, a quiet acceptance of the world around him. And though he didn't come as close to David as he had hoped, there was a definite difference. One day, while David was placing food near the shed, he noticed a small movement at the corner of his eye. When he turned, he saw Ghost, standing just a few feet away, watching him. David's heart skipped a beat. The dog wasn't running, wasn't retreating. He was simply standing there, looking at David, as if waiting for something. David held his breath. Slowly, carefully, he crouched down, offering his hand, just as he had done so many times before. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered, his voice barely a murmur in the stillness of the morning. The next few days brought more subtle changes. David noticed the neighbors tossing scraps of food near the shed as they passed by, offering small gestures of kindness to Ghost. Mrs. Patterson had started leaving bits of chicken by the fence near her house, and old Mr. Grant, who usually didn't care about anything beyond his garden, had placed a bowl of water near the front porch one particularly hot afternoon. It was small, insignificant acts, but they were acts of care, acts of recognition. David continued with his routine, still leaving food for Ghost every morning, still stepping back to give the dog space, still waiting for that quiet moment of trust. And over time, Ghost began to show more signs of change. His fur, once coarse and matted, began to grow in a little more neatly. His limp, though still visible, seemed less pronounced. There was a slight shift in his body language, a quiet acceptance of the world around him. And though he didn't come as close to David as he had hoped, there was a definite difference. One day, while David was placing food near the shed, he noticed a small movement at the corner of his eye. When he turned, he saw Ghost, standing just a few feet away, watching him. David's heart skipped a beat. The dog wasn't running, wasn't retreating. He was simply standing there, looking at David, as if waiting for something. David held his breath. Slowly, carefully, he crouched down, offering his hand, just as he had done so many times before. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered, his voice barely a murmur in the stillness of the morning. David decided to take the next step. He needed to find a way to get Ghost medical help. The vet, Dr. Ramirez, had been recommended by Mrs. Patterson, and David had been meaning to call her for some time. But every time he thought about it, he realized that in order to get Ghost the treatment he needed, he had to get close enough to catch him. And that wasn't going to be easy. He couldn't simply grab the dog. That would only make him run, only reinforce the walls he had been building up for years. No, David needed a different approach. He needed to earn Ghost's trust, and to do that, he had to be patient. He thought back to his training, the lessons he had learned as a medic in the army. When treating injured soldiers, it had always been about establishing trust. The same principles applied here. If he could get Ghost to trust him enough to let him get close, then he might have a chance at helping the dog. But the process would be slow, and David knew that the longer he waited, the worse Ghost's condition would become. And so, he began a new approach. He started spending more time with Ghost, sitting on the log just outside the shed for longer stretches of time. He stopped rushing through the feeding rituals and allowed the dog to come to him on his own terms. He kept his movements slow, steady, and non-threatening. At first, Ghost would stay at the edge of the woods, watching David with cautious eyes. But gradually, he began to move closer, just a little bit each time. David didn't make a sound, didn't even shift in his seat. He just stayed there, watching the dog, offering nothing but quiet patience. It was the morning of the third day that things started to change.
David had brought a blanket with him, something soft to offer Ghost, a way to show that he wasn't just there to take, but to give. He laid the blanket on the ground near the food and waited. He didn't expect much. He had learned by now not to rush the process. But what happened next was nothing short of miraculous. Ghost approached the blanket slowly, carefully, his eyes flicking nervously between David and the ground. He sniffed at it cautiously, as though testing whether it was safe. Then, without warning, he lay down on it. It wasn't much, just a brief moment of surrender, but it was enough. David's heart leapt in his chest. This was a breakthrough. Ghost was beginning to trust him, really trust him, for the first time in years. David remained still, his pulse quickening with the realization that he was on the verge of something big. He didn't want to move, didn't want to risk scaring the dog off. So, he stayed where he was, allowing Ghost to stay as long as he needed. The dog stayed on the blanket for a good while, occasionally shifting, but never fully retreating. And David just watched, feeling a mix of awe and gratitude. The following days were filled with the same routine, but now, there was a sense of urgency in David's actions. He had started making calls to local vets, looking for someone who might be able to help Ghost. He had explained the situation to Dr. Ramirez, and the vet had been understanding. However, David still faced the immense challenge of getting the dog to the clinic. The more time passed, the more David noticed the toll the infection was taking on Ghost's health. His limp had worsened, and he seemed weaker, more hesitant to approach the food David left out for him. It was clear that time was running out. David had to act, and he had to act fast. But how? One evening, as he was walking back to his house after leaving food for Ghost, a thought struck him. He couldn't force the dog to come to him. He couldn't make the dog trust him in an instant. But what if there was another way to earn Ghost's trust? What if he could provide something that the dog needed, a safe space to rest, to heal, away from the dangers of the streets? David decided to try something new. The next morning, he brought a large crate with him, one that he had borrowed from a neighbor. It was large enough for Ghost to fit comfortably, but small enough to keep him secure. David lined it with blankets and placed some food inside. He knew this might be a long shot, but he hoped that Ghost might feel comfortable enough to enter it. As David approached the shed, he saw Ghost standing just beyond the edge of the woods, watching him. The dog's eyes were wary, his body tense, but there was something different in his posture, a slight change that suggested curiosity. David knelt down and set the crate on the ground, leaving the door open. Then, he backed away slowly, giving the dog space. For several minutes, nothing happened. But then, to David's amazement, Ghost began to approach the crate. He sniffed at the edge of the opening, his body still hesitant, but less stiff than before. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped inside. David's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Ghost had entered the crate on his own. David wasted no time. He closed the door gently, careful not to startle the dog. Ghost remained still, but David could hear his breathing, slow, steady, calm. He had done it. The next step was taking the dog to the vet. As David prepared to move the crate, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. They were moving forward. Ghost was on the brink of a new chapter in his life, and so was David. For the first time in years, the dog would receive the help he so desperately needed. And for the first time in a long time, David felt like he was on the right path. But there was no time to waste. With Ghost safely secured in the crate, David lifted it carefully and began the long walk to Dr. Ramirez's clinic. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be challenges. But David had come too far to stop now. This was a turning point, for both of them. As David walked, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led him here, the loneliness he had once felt, the quiet bond that had formed between him and the dog, and the hope that had grown from the seeds of patience and compassion. It wasn't just about rescuing a dog. It was about healing, about second chances. And in that moment, as he carried Ghost to the clinic, David realized that he, too, was healing. The walk to Dr. Ramirez's clinic was the longest journey David had ever taken with Ghost. Every step felt like a mile, and yet it was only a short distance from David's home to the clinic. The weight of the crate, though not unbearable, felt heavier with each passing minute. The air was thick with anticipation, and David's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Was Ghost ready for this? Would he allow himself to trust David enough to accept the help he needed? David glanced down at the crate as he walked, his heart pounding. Inside, Ghost was still, no movement, no sounds, only the occasional shift of the dog's body as he adjusted to his new surroundings. David had tried to make the crate as comfortable as possible, lining it with soft blankets, but he knew that the journey was still a scary one for the dog. He had lived for years on the streets, avoiding human contact and the threats of animal control. This was a big step for him. But David had made a promise to himself and to Ghost. He would do everything he could to give this dog a chance at life. The small town around them seemed quiet, as it always did in the early morning hours. There were few people on the streets, and the ones who were out barely noticed David and his unusual cargo. But David wasn't concerned with anyone else's gaze. His focus was on Ghost, on getting the dog to safety, on ensuring that he would receive the care he so desperately needed. By the time they reached the clinic, David's arms ached from carrying the crate, but he refused to set it down. He knew that this was the turning point, the moment when Ghost's future would change forever. He wasn't sure what to expect when the dog was examined, but he knew that they had made it this far together. And that, in itself, was something worth celebrating. Ramirez was waiting for them at the door when David arrived. She had been informed in advance that David was bringing Ghost in, and she had already prepared for the examination. The gentle vet smiled when she saw David approach, but her eyes softened when she saw the crate. There was no judgment, no surprise, only empathy. She was a woman who understood what David had been doing, and she knew how important this moment was for both of them. "Let's get him inside, Dr. Ramirez said softly, as David carefully set the crate down on the ground. David opened the crate door slowly, giving Ghost the space to come out on his own. The dog remained inside, his body tense, but he didn't resist when David reached in to gently coax him out. With a few soft words, David eased Ghost out of the crate, and the dog stood shakily on the floor, looking around nervously. "He's been through a lot," David murmured, watching as Ghost sniffed the air, his movements cautious but not entirely fearful. Ramirez knelt down beside the dog, offering a reassuring smile. "I can see that," she said softly, "but we'll take good care of him." The next few minutes were a blur of activity as Dr. Ramirez and her staff carefully examined Ghost. She could see right away how much the dog had been through. His fur was thin and patchy, his body frail and dehydrated. The limp in his leg was more pronounced now, and there were signs of infection near the old wound, which had gone untreated for far too long. The vet's hands were gentle, moving over Ghost's body with a quiet understanding. She could tell that this dog had suffered. "I'm glad you brought him in, Dr. Ramirez said quietly, glancing at David. "This wound is serious. We'll need to clean it, and we'll start him on some antibiotics right away. But I think he'll be okay. He's strong." David nodded, his eyes softening as he watched the vet work. He knew it would be a long road to recovery for Ghost. He would need time to heal, both physically and emotionally. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that there was hope for the dog. After the initial examination, Dr. Ramirez set up an IV to hydrate Ghost and began administering the antibiotics to fight the infection. David stayed by the dog's side, his hand resting gently on the dog's head. Ghost didn't pull away this time. He didn't flinch when David touched him. The trust they had been building was starting to show in small but significant ways. For the first time, Ghost allowed someone to care for him without retreating, without the need to escape. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental to David. He watched as the vet worked, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for everything Dr. Ramirez had done. He knew that without her, this journey would have been much harder, if not impossible. "David," Dr. Ramirez said after a while, once the procedure was finished, "I'm going to need you to stay with him for a bit. He's going to be groggy from the sedation, but he should be okay. We'll monitor him closely, and then you can take him home once he's stable." David nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with gratitude. Ramirez smiled warmly. "You're doing great. He's lucky to have you." David stayed in the clinic for hours, watching over Ghost as he rested. The dog had drifted off into a deep sleep, his body finally getting the rest it so desperately needed. David didn't mind the wait. He was just grateful that Ghost was getting the care he needed. As the sun began to set, Dr. Ramirez came back into the room, her expression thoughtful. "He's doing well," she said. "The infection is serious, but with the antibiotics, we should be able to get it under control. The wound will need to be cleaned daily, and we'll have to keep a close eye on his recovery, but he's strong. He's resilient." David breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you," he said again, "for everything." "You're welcome," Dr. Ramirez replied. "It's clear that you care deeply about him. That kind of care makes all the difference." David looked down at Ghost, who was still resting, but his breathing was steady and calm. He had made it through the first hurdle. Now, they would face the next challenge together, healing, both of them. As David left the clinic that evening, the weight of what had just happened settled into his bones. This was the beginning of something new for Ghost, for him, and for the town. No longer would Ghost be a forgotten stray, lingering in the shadows. He was no longer invisible. And neither was David. They were both on a journey now, one that would require patience, compassion, and a deep commitment to healing. But with every step they took together, the bond between them grew stronger. David had given this dog a second chance at life. And in return, Ghost had given David something even more valuable, a purpose. The following days were a blur of routine, but this time, it was a routine filled with purpose. David continued to visit the clinic every day, sitting by Ghost's side as the dog slept, recovering from the infection and the trauma of the past. The clinic staff were kind, and Dr. Ramirez kept him updated on Ghost's progress. The wound was healing slowly, but steadily. The antibiotics were working, and the dog's appetite had improved significantly. Ghost was no longer the frail, trembling figure that had first arrived at the clinic. There was a quiet strength beginning to return to him, a glimmer of hope that David hadn't dared to imagine just a few weeks ago. David's visits became the highlight of his day. He had always known the healing power of caring for others, but this was different. Ghost wasn't just another patient. He was a partner, a companion, someone who had been through as much as David had, maybe more. They understood each other in ways that no one else could. Every moment spent in the clinic, watching the dog rest and recover, felt like a victory. But more than that, it was a reminder of what was possible when someone refused to give up. It wasn't just David who was affected by Ghost's recovery. The entire town seemed to be taking notice. It started with small things, a neighbor dropping by to check on the dog, a child who had once whispered stories about the stray now leaving him scraps of food in the morning. Slowly, the indifference that had marked the town's relationship with Ghost began to shift. People were beginning to care. Mrs. Patterson, the kind-hearted woman who had supported David from the beginning, had been the first to bring up the change she had seen in the dog. "He's not the same dog," she said one day as she walked with David toward the clinic. "There's something about him now. He's different. He looks hopeful." David smiled, his heart swelling at her words. "I think he's starting to believe that not everyone is going to hurt him," he said, his voice filled with quiet emotion. "And maybe, just maybe, I'm starting to believe that too." But it wasn't just Mrs. Patterson who noticed the transformation. Other townsfolk began to step forward, their curiosity piqued. They had seen the quiet dedication David had shown Ghost, and they couldn't help but admire it. Some came to David's door to offer their support, asking if there was anything they could do to help. Others stopped by the clinic to check on Ghost, their eyes filled with tentative hope. Even Mr. Thompson, the neighbor who had once dismissed David's efforts as a waste of time, had begun to soften. One day, as David was walking down the street, he noticed the older man standing on his porch, watching him. David had grown used to the man's critical glances, but today, something was different. Thompson didn't say anything at first. He just nodded. "He's looking better, Mr. Thompson finally said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Maybe you're right. Maybe he's worth the trouble after all." David nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement, though he didn't let it show too much. "He's worth every bit of it." It wasn't a loud, dramatic shift. It wasn't a moment of sudden transformation. But over time, the town began to change. The once forgotten stray was becoming something more, a symbol of resilience, of second chances, and of the quiet power of compassion. The town, once indifferent to Ghost's suffering, was now beginning to see the dog for who he truly was, not just a stray, but a survivor. David was no longer alone in his efforts. People began to offer help in small ways. A woman at the local bakery started bringing over treats for Ghost when David visited the clinic. Children, who had once whispered about the dog with fear or curiosity, now made cards and drawings for him. The town that had once ignored him was now embracing him, one act of kindness at a time. But even with all the support, the most important transformation was happening within the walls of David's home. As Ghost recovered, David's own healing began. He had spent so many years trying to outrun his memories, burying the pain of his past, but Ghost had given him something he hadn't realized he needed, a chance to truly care again, to have a purpose beyond the weight of his own scars. Every evening when he returned home from the clinic, he would sit on the porch with Ghost by his side. The dog had begun to join him outside, slowly stepping into the yard, sniffing the air, taking in the new world that was finally beginning to open up to him. It wasn't easy for Ghost, his fears and anxieties were still deeply rooted, but with each day, he grew a little stronger. He would walk a little further, explore a little more, and at night, he would curl up at David's feet, content for the first time in years. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. They were no longer just man and dog, they were companions, partners in healing. David had given Ghost a second chance, but in return, Ghost had given him something far more precious, the ability to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. The progress was slow, but it was steady. Ghost's limp remained, though it was less pronounced than it had been when David first found him. His coat grew thicker, his eyes brighter, and the haunting look that had once defined him slowly faded into something more peaceful. He had scars, physical and emotional, that would never fully heal, but he was learning to trust again. And that, in itself, was a victory. David couldn't help but marvel at the way their lives had intertwined. When he had first seen Ghost, the dog had been a ghost, a shadow, an invisible part of the town. But now, Ghost was living, breathing, and thriving. The dog who had once been forgotten had become a symbol of hope for everyone around him. As the weeks went by, David continued to visit the clinic, but now, the visits felt less urgent. Ghost was stable, his condition improving, and David's role had shifted from caretaker to companion. The days of rushing to the clinic every morning were over. Now, their mornings were spent in the quiet rhythm of daily life. Ghost had come home with David, and together, they were learning to navigate the world, step by careful step. David knew that the road ahead would still have challenges. There would be setbacks, times when Ghost's fears would resurface, moments when the past would come rushing back to haunt them both. But David had learned something important in these last few months. Healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and he was no longer walking that path alone. One afternoon, as David and Ghost walked through the woods near their home, David couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground, and for the first time in a long while, David felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Ghost trotted ahead, his tail wagging gently, and David smiled. They had both come a long way, and as they walked together, side by side, David knew that this was just the beginning. Ghost's journey had only just started, and so had his. Together, they were learning to heal, to trust, and to live. And in that quiet moment, under the dappled sunlight, David understood the truth. Sometimes, the most powerful bonds are the ones formed not by blood, but by kindness, patience, and the willingness to give second chances. David had always believed in the power of second chances, but as he stood in the yard, watching Ghost play with the neighborhood children, he realized just how transformative one act of kindness could be. The dog, who had once been the invisible figure lurking in the shadows, was now an active part of the community. Children who had once been afraid of him now laughed as they ran alongside him, gently patting his head and offering him treats. The transformation was remarkable. Ghost had come so far. His limp was still there, but it was now just a faint reminder of the dog he had once been. His coat was thick and shiny, his eyes bright with curiosity and life. The fearful, guarded animal that David had first met was slowly being replaced by a dog who trusted the world again. And as much as it was Ghost's victory, it was also David's. Together, they had fought for a better life, a life where trust and compassion were no longer foreign concepts. But just when things seemed to be settling,
Mrs. Brown, who had once walked past the dog without a second glance, now saw him as a threat, and her concern had become the catalyst for a possible disaster. David couldn't let this happen. He had come too far, and Ghost had made too much progress to be taken away now. The dog's entire future hung in the balance, and David wasn't about to let the town's old prejudices against strays determine his fate. He took a deep breath, stepping closer to the officers. "This dog is not a threat," David said firmly. "He's been through and now. She says the dog's been causing problems, and she's worried about her pets." David's blood ran cold. The officers weren't there to help Ghost. They were there because of the complaint. "Gay, he's not aggressive. He's been healing, and he's become part of this community. I won't let him be taken." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "We understand," one officer said slowly, "but we're responding to a complaint. If this continues, we may have no choice but to intervene." David's stomach twisted. He knew how these things worked. Once animal control got involved, the situation could escalate quickly, and there was no telling what would happen to Ghost. His heart raced, and he looked over at the dog, who was now cowering by David's feet, his tail tucked between his legs. This was a turning point. David had always believed in the quiet power of patience and kindness, but now he had to act. This wasn't just about Ghost anymore. This was about the entire town, and how far they had come in learning to care for a dog that had once been invisible. He couldn't let the fear and ignorance of a few dictate the fate of an animal who had earned his place in this town. "I'll take full responsibility for him," David said, his voice unwavering. "He's not dangerous. He's part of this community, and I'm not going to let him be taken away." The officers didn't respond immediately, but David could see that his words had an effect. They were hesitant, unsure of what to do. Mrs. Brown stood nearby, arms crossed over her chest, but even she seemed less certain than before. "I've had enough of this," Mrs. Brown finally said, her voice loud again. "I've had enough of that filthy dog roaming my yard. You need to do something about it." David stood his ground, his body tense with frustration. "Mrs. Brown, Ghost has never harmed anyone. He's just trying to survive. He doesn't deserve to be punished for that." The conversation grew more heated, but just as David felt his anger rising, a familiar voice broke through the tension. It was Mrs. Patterson, walking toward them with a determined look on her face. "Excuse me," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice calm but firm, "but I have to agree with David here. Ghost has been nothing but a gentle soul. I've seen him interact with my children. He's not a threat, and he's become part of our community. We all have a responsibility to care for him now." The officers paused, listening to Mrs. Patterson. David could see that the tide was beginning to turn. More neighbors were stepping forward now, quietly voicing their support for Ghost. It wasn't just David anymore. It was the entire community standing together, recognizing that Ghost had earned his place in their lives. The officers looked at each other again. One of them sighed, lowering his gaze. "I think we've heard enough," the officer said, his tone softening. "We'll call animal control and tell them there's no need for action." David's heart raced as he realized what was happening. Mrs. Brown, her face flushed with frustration, could do nothing but stand silently as the officers turned and walked away. The crowd dispersed, but David stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't just about Ghost anymore. It was about the change that had begun in the town, a shift in how they viewed not just animals, but each other. Compassion had won out, and the community had shown that it was willing to stand up for what was right. As David turned back to Ghost, who was now wagging his tail cautiously, he felt a deep sense of relief. The battle had been won, but it had been a battle he hadn't expected. The town was starting to understand something fundamental, that kindness, patience, and understanding could change everything. Ghost wasn't just a stray anymore. He was a living testament to the power of second chances, and the community had given him one. David crouched down, offering a reassuring pat to Ghost's head. "You're safe, buddy," he said softly. "We've got this." And as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the town, David knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Ghost had found his place in the world, and so had David. The weeks that followed the incident with animal control were marked by a sense of calm, a steady rhythm that began to take root in David and Ghost's lives. The town, which had once ignored or dismissed the stray dog, now embraced him in ways David had never imagined. Ghost was no longer the forgotten creature on the fringes of town life. He had become a symbol of hope, a living testament to the power of second chances. David's mornings began to feel like a comfortable routine, albeit one that was always filled with purpose. Every morning he would take a walk with Ghost through the fields and woods near his house. The dog was getting stronger each day, his limp growing less pronounced as his muscles and joints healed. The ragged coat that had once hung from his thin body had become glossy and full. Ghost's eyes, once distant and fearful, were now filled with a quiet curiosity. He explored his surroundings with a growing sense of confidence, taking in the sights, sounds, and smells of a world that had once been too overwhelming for him to trust. David couldn't help but smile as he watched Ghost trot ahead of him, his tail wagging happily. The dog was more than just a companion. He had become a mirror for David's own healing. As Ghost found his place in the world, so did David. The weight of his own past, the scars of war and loss, seemed a little lighter now that he had something, or rather someone, to care for again. But despite the quiet peace that had settled over them, David knew that their journey was far from over. Ghost still had his fears, his anxieties, and David was no stranger to the fact that healing for both of them was a long and winding road. There would still be setbacks, moments when Ghost's past would resurface, And there would be moments when David would need to call on his patience, his strength, and his unwavering belief in the dog's ability to heal. One afternoon, as David and Ghost were returning from their walk, he noticed a group of children gathered near the park. They were laughing and playing as children do, but as David approached, he noticed something that made his heart sink. Ghost was in the middle of the group, but he was trembling, his body tense and rigid. The children, who had once been afraid of him, were now reaching out to pet him, but Ghost was clearly overwhelmed by the attention. David's heart raced. He knew that Ghost had made incredible strides in his recovery, but moments like these were a reminder that the dog's fears weren't gone. Ghost's past was not something that could be erased in a few weeks. The fear of being hurt, of being abandoned, still lingered deep within him. "Hey, guys," David called out, his voice calm but firm. "Give him some space." The children turned and looked at David, their faces filled with curiosity, but no malice. They had grown fond of Ghost over the past weeks, but they didn't understand what he had been through. "Sorry, Mr. David," one of the boys said sheepishly. "We were just petting him." David smiled gently but shook his head. "He's not quite ready for that much attention yet. Ghost needs his space." The children nodded and backed away, giving the dog some room to breathe. Ghost took a few steps back, his body still trembling but visibly relieved to have the pressure lifted. David knelt down beside him, offering a comforting hand to the dog's head. He could feel the dog's body relax under his touch, the tension slowly ebbing away. "I know, buddy," David murmured softly, rubbing Ghost's ears. "It's okay. You don't have to do anything you don't want to." Ghost lifted his head and looked at David with those familiar, quiet eyes. Eyes that still carried the shadows of the past, but also the flicker of hope. David's heart swelled as he gazed into them. This was a reminder of how far they had come, but also how far they still had to go. It wasn't just about the physical healing, it was about the emotional scars that Ghost had carried for so long, those couldn't be healed overnight. As the days passed, David continued to work with Ghost, helping him adjust to the world around him in small, manageable ways. He would take the dog on quiet walks, keeping him away from crowded areas. They spent time in the yard, where Ghost could roam freely without the fear of being overwhelmed. Slowly, the dog began to show more confidence. His steps became less hesitant, his body more relaxed. But even as the dog's physical recovery continued, David knew that there were still moments of uncertainty, moments when Ghost would falter and retreat into the safety of the shadows. And then, one morning, the test came. It was a quiet day, the kind of day where everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. The air was crisp, the sky clear and blue. David had taken Ghost for their usual morning walk through the woods, but when they arrived back home, they found something that shattered the peace they had built together. Standing on David's porch was none other than Mrs. Brown, her arms crossed over her chest and a stern expression on her face. David's stomach dropped as he recognized her. "David," she said, her voice cold and accusing, "I need to talk to you." David felt the familiar tension rise in his chest. He had hoped that things had settled down, that the community was beginning to understand Ghost. But here was Mrs. Brown, a reminder that some people would never let go of their fears. "What is it, Mrs. Brown?" David asked, trying to keep his tone steady. "I've been talking to the other neighbors," she said sharply, "and we've decided that it's time for you to keep that dog on a leash or get rid of him altogether." David's heart sank. He knew that Mrs. Brown was one of the last holdouts in the community. She hadn't been won over by Ghost's progress, and now she was rallying others to push for his removal. The familiar anger flared in David's chest, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself that this wasn't about confrontation, it was about Ghost. "Mrs. Brown, Ghost isn't a threat," David said calmly, stepping closer to her. "He's not aggressive. He's just been through a lot, and he's learning to trust people again. He's part of this community now." "I don't care what you think," she shot back. "My kids shouldn't be near that animal, and I'm not the only one who feels that way." David felt the pressure of the situation mounting. This wasn't just about a single dog anymore. It was about the values of the entire town. The community had come together to support Ghost, but there were still people like Mrs. Brown who couldn't see past their own fears. "We've all worked hard to accept him," David said, his voice unwavering, "and I'm not going to let a few people scare us into turning him away." The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment it seemed like the argument would escalate. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson, who had been standing a few steps behind Mrs. Brown, stepped forward. "David's right," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice strong. "We've all seen how far Ghost has come, and we've seen the change in the community. The dog isn't a threat. We need to stop letting fear decide what happens here." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Mrs. Patterson's voice had a steady authority, and her support made a difference. Slowly, other neighbors began to speak up, their voices rising in quiet unity. "I agree," Mr. Grant said from his porch. "I've seen that dog with my own eyes. He's not dangerous." "Well," Mrs. Brown said, her voice wavering, "maybe I was wrong about him, but I'm still not comfortable with him being so close to my kids." "We understand," Mrs. Patterson said kindly, "but Ghost has a place here now. He belongs with us." And just like that, the tide turned. Slowly but surely, the community rallied around Ghost, reminding themselves of the power of second chances and the importance of compassion. Mrs. Brown, though reluctant, eventually backed down. She didn't agree, but she no longer had the support she had once had. David looked down at Ghost, who was standing quietly beside him, watching the scene unfold. The dog's eyes met his, and for the first time in a long while, David saw the trust in them, unspoken but undeniable. Ghost had found his place, and so had David. As the day drew to a close, David sat on his porch with Ghost at his feet, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The battle had been hard fought, but it had been won. Ghost was part of this town, and he always would be. The sun had set on the small town, casting long shadows across the streets. The quiet evening was filled with the soft sounds of nature, chirping crickets, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional barking of a dog in the distance. David sat on his porch, his eyes fixed on the horizon as he sipped his coffee. Beside him, Ghost lay peacefully, his head resting on his paws. The dog was calm, content in the moment, and for the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The journey they had taken together, David and Ghost, had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also been a journey of healing, of trust, and of second chances. There had been moments of doubt, times when both of them had wondered if they could overcome their pasts. But now, as they sat side by side, it was clear that they had both found something they hadn't expected, a home, a family, and a place where they belonged. David's thoughts drifted back to the day he had first encountered Ghost. The dog had been a shadow on the streets, a figure that was ignored, forgotten by everyone. But David had seen something in those eyes, something he could relate to. And now, as he sat on the porch with the dog, David couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. Ghost wasn't just a stray anymore. He was a part of the town, a part of their lives, and a symbol of what could happen when compassion and patience were given a chance. It wasn't just David and Ghost who had changed. The entire town had transformed. The community, once indifferent to the stray dog, had rallied around him. They had learned to see the value in the dog's quiet strength, in the way he had overcome his fears, and in the trust he had placed in them. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but the town had learned to care. They had learned to embrace the idea of second chances, and in doing so, they had become a better version of themselves. David glanced over at Mrs. Patterson, who was sitting on her own porch a few houses down. She had been one of the first to step forward in support of Ghost, and her encouragement had been instrumental in changing the minds of others. The townspeople, once skeptical, now saw the dog for who he truly was, a survivor, a symbol of resilience. And through Ghost's journey, they had all been reminded of the importance of compassion. David's mind wandered to the day when Mrs. Brown had tried to have Ghost removed, when it seemed like the town might be divided once again. That day had been a turning point. It had been a test of not just Ghost's place in the community, but of the town's character. But in the end, the community had come together, choosing empathy over fear. It wasn't just about Ghost anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for offering support when it was needed most. David had learned something valuable through all of this. Sometimes the road to healing is not a straight line. There will always be setbacks, challenges, and moments when it feels like everything is falling apart. But the key is in the journey itself, the small victories, the quiet moments of trust, and the understanding that no one is ever truly alone if they have people who care. The soft crunch of gravel underfoot interrupted his thoughts. David turned to see Mrs. Patterson walking toward him, her face lit by the soft glow of the porch light. "Evening, David," she said with a smile, her voice warm. "How's Ghost doing?" David looked down at the dog, who was now stretching out on the porch, his eyes half closed in contentment. "He's doing well," David replied, his voice filled with pride. "Better than I could have ever hoped for." Mrs. Patterson smiled, her eyes softening as she glanced at the dog. "You know, it's amazing to see how much he's changed. I remember when he was just that quiet, fearful thing lurking in the shadows, but now he's one of us." David nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "It's been a long road, but worth every step." The two stood in silence for a moment, watching Ghost, who had now rolled over onto his back, paws in the air, content and carefree. It was hard to believe that this was the same dog who had once cowered in fear, unable to trust anyone, and it was even harder to believe that David had once felt the same way, alone, disconnected, carrying scars that no one could see. But now, as he sat with Ghost at his side, David realized that healing was never about forgetting the past. It was about learning to live with it, to find peace in the present, and to move forward with hope. He had given Ghost a second chance, but in doing so, he had given himself one too. That dog's brought something special to this town, Mrs. Patterson said quietly, her gaze fixed on Ghost. Something we didn't even know we were missing. David smiled softly. I think we all needed him more than we realized. The two of them stood there for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky. The quiet hum of the town around them, the distant sounds of life continuing as it always did, was comforting. Ghost, now fully recovered, was at peace, and David felt like he was finally at peace too. As the days continued to pass, Ghost became more and more integrated into the fabric of the town. He wasn't just a stray anymore. He was a part of the town's identity, a reminder of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The children, who had once been afraid of him, now greeted him with smiles and gentle pats on the head. The neighbors, who had once dismissed him, now looked out for him, leaving food and water for him when David couldn't be around. And David, who had once carried the weight of his past alone, now shared his life with a dog who understood what it meant to fight for a better future. The town had learned something important from Ghost, just as David had. They had learned that everyone deserves a second chance, that no one should ever be forgotten, and that the power of compassion can transform lives. As the seasons changed and the trees shed their leaves for the winter, David and Ghost continued their quiet walks through the woods. They still had challenges to face, and the road ahead would not always be easy. But now they walked side by side, their bond stronger than ever, with the knowledge that together they could face whatever came next. The town, too, had changed. They had come together, united by the love and care for a dog who had once been invisible. And in doing so, they had learned that sometimes it's the smallest acts of kindness that have the power to change the world.